Being a wealth manager doesn't make you immune to making bad investing decisions. So in today's video, I'm going to share 6 times that I got it wrong and what it cost me and what you can do to avoid it. I find that one of the reasons that hold most people back from getting started investing, particularly women, is that they are worried about making a mistake, which is totally valid. It makes a lot of sense. You don't want your hard-earned money to fall foul to a scam. You don't want to lose it all because you've probably worked damn hard to get it. But mistakes are part of the journey. No one's perfect and no one knows it all. It's just about the type of mistakes that you make when it comes to investing and how you can rectify them as well to make sure that your overall financial picture isn't too negatively impacted. Hi, welcome back. My name is Zoe and this is my channel Words on Wealth, where I make investing simple, from the basics all the way through to how you can translate some everyday headlines into your portfolios. It's all about it being not so difficult. So if you are enjoying my content, please do make sure you give me a like and a subscribe, and feel free to drop me a message as to what you would like to be broken down next. And for a bit of background on me before I leap into these mistakes that I made when first starting investing. I grew up very lucky in a household where we had enough money, but it wasn't the norm that my parents invested. I remember them talking once about having had shares from Santander. And, throwback, I remember them checking it on the CFAX of the television, so a little thing that we had where you typed it into the remote to see what the share prices were doing. But rarely was the narrative that it was positive. In fact, often they weren't doing quite so well. And that was about the extent to the exposure I had to investing until I entered the financial industry aged 22. At this point, it was quite a steep learning curve. I'd studied a lot of economics, both at school and throughout my university degree, but I hadn't studied personal finance, and suddenly I was training up to be a financial advisor. Throw into the mix that I'm British, and I started my career in Milan, living in Italy. That meant that things weren't going to be quite as straightforward as if I was just British living in the UK and had access to products that I could understand because they were in my language or because they had certain tax benefits with them as well. But I think it's really important to note that nobody is perfect. And as I say, I made some investing mistakes so that you don't have to. Let's dive into the first one. The first mistake I made is kind of the biggest one, and I think the one that a lot of people will at some point, if not always, make. And that was the cost of just not getting started. I have a bit of a good girl complex. I did an awful lot of hard work at school to get good grades, and as a result, I don't like doing things wrong. But what that means is that when it comes to things like investing, I like to know that I'm doing exactly the right thing. But there's no such thing as exactly the right thing. And all that time that I'm trying to find this perfect, in inverted commas, solution to avoid being the bad girl and not doing quite right means that I've missed out on that time in the market. So in reality, whilst I started working in finance at around 22, it was actually about 23, 24 that I started investing, so a few years later when I felt confidence, even though, ironically, I was already working in the industry and had a few qualifications under my belt at that point too. The reason why this first one is such a big and fundamental mistake is due to the laws of compounding. When we look at the difference that it can make when you start investing age 20 versus even starting investing age 30 with the same amount, we see wildly different figures. And that's all thanks to the fact that over time, the money that is invested can really start to compound. Now, if you're older than 20, 30, 40, or even 50, and you're thinking, oh heck, it's already too late. The reality is it's never too late, because every day there'll be a new day, and that's every day that you've potentially missed, but it's also a day that you can still get ahead and not miss the tomorrow. The second biggest mistake that I made was all about leaving tax benefits on the table. Now, as I mentioned, when I first started my career and when I first started investing, I was living in Italy. Now, in Italy, there are not as many, if any, tax-advantaged products to start investing like what we have in the UK with an ISA. Equally, in the US, Australia, New Zealand, you'll be familiar with similar products. There are some too in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. All of these allow for you to start investing in a relatively tax-efficient fashion. Now, if you're in these countries, using them is frankly often a no-brainer. Because if you can invest in a way that's quite tax-efficient, why not? Now, of course, I was in Italy, so this wasn't an option. But I was only there for 4 years. I did then come back to the UK, where I then was able to access the likes of Stocks on Shares ISAs. But you know what happens, life gets in the way with a move, a fresh start, a new city. I was a bit slow to get going, and what this meant is that I left my investments in a platform that did not have relevant tax protections that I could have taken advantage of for a longer period of time whilst in the UK. So if you do have things like ISAs, like ASKs, like 401ks open and available to you in the country in which you live, do check out if it is potentially the best place to get going. And if you haven't started by using one of these products, then you can always look to transfer and start now and take advantage of the tax benefits whilst they are there. Now, the third biggest mistake I made is around the investments that I chose to put in my starting portfolio. So despite the fact that I was working in the industry and seeing fund managers come in to talk to us every day about how great their fund was and how also the market performs in general and how matching the market with the likes of ETFs is relatively foolproof, I still thought, nah, I'm going in with individual stocks. And one of the first investments I made was into 5 different individuals. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It allowed me some exploration. It allowed me to play around with some of those stocks. I added some more in later on as well. But what I quickly realised is that it's an ego game. I found now, and with loads and loads of reading, that for me, following the market and having a diversified fund portfolio is one of the easiest and simple ways to consistently outperform that ego game and to beat all of the admin, all of the need for analysis that goes into stocks and still doesn't have a guaranteed outcome. Now, it's worth saying that there's no guarantees with any of it, but with the research that I've seen and what I believe is that individual stock picking rarely pays off, particularly for the likes of you and I. So the next big mistake I made is all about fees. Now, there are fees associated at every turn, whether it's from the platform that you're using to invest through, whether it's trading fees, or whether they are fees associated with the specific fund. And it can be quite a lot to keep on top of. There is no such thing as a free lunch, as we say. And what that means is that you're always comparing different prices. Now, even as somebody that does a lot of work in finance, after a certain period, I find comparing prices tedious. My partner will be the first person to tell you that when in the supermarket, I'm happy to try and find a good deal, but I'm not happy to stand there for 40 minutes whilst comparing the different bags of pasta. However, when we look at this from an investing perspective, what this slight impatience that I have can do means that actually some of your overall growth can be eroded. And when we're thinking about compounding as well over time, higher charges over 20, 30 years can really eat into the potential growth that you could see in your investments. So remember what I said, there is no such thing as a free lunch. And I personally don't like to put a figure on a too high, too expensive, because it's really all relative. The platforms that are available to you in your country will be quite different for each and every one of us. And what that means is that their prices will be different. But you need to compare like with like. Same goes for funds. Make sure that when comparing like with like, you're not picking a wildly expensive one, because frankly, unless there's a real argument to do so, what is the point? Now, the 5th mistake I made isn't normally one that I would say is a usual move for me, or in fact, a lot of women that I do speak to that get started investing. And that 5th mistake is all about joining the hype train. Basically, I got FOMO and bought investments that were either not quite right for me, didn't fit in the portfolio, or frankly just a bit stupid. The most recent example being I had exposure to gold in a previous portfolio. I'd then been slow, don't know if you're noticing a theme here, at reinvesting into gold and waited, and it was popping up in the headlines an awful lot. If you do follow my market news videos, then what you'll see is that gold has been at all-time highs for quite some time. I, like the fool I am, invested at nearly one of these all-time highs, and then for a good few weeks afterwards, watched it unfortunately come back down again. But there's a lesson for all of us in that. It's a long-term view, and jumping on hype just because you've seen it in headlines doesn't always pay off. None of us know what is round the corner. So whilst gold had been at all-time highs for quite some time, obviously I invested into it just as it decided to come back down a little bit again. Now, it has since come back up, and over the long run, I know that it serves a purpose in my portfolio. But the lesson to be learned is just jumping on something because you've seen it, not thinking about it more strategically, and not making sure that it fits in your portfolio. In this case, for me, it did, so it doesn't matter quite so much. But all of these things can have a very negative overall impact on your investments if you don't take them into account. And my final mistake, if you haven't picked up on this from some of the key themes that I've talked about in this video, is not setting and not forgetting. When we're thinking about long-term investing, it's really important that there is a level of consistency and also that things remain invested. Now, we'll all be guilty of this. Lives are busy. It's what happens. Even I do it, as we've just been discussing. But not setting and investing and forgetting, for example, to invest, leaving things in cash over a period of time, perhaps not investing routinely every month because it just goes out your mind, it's been an expensive month. All of this opens you up over time to that lower figure of what's going in and what can then compound. So what does all this mean for you, and what can you take away from my mistakes that I've learnt for you? First and foremost, it's that we do all make mistakes, and so don't beat yourself up. I've worked in the industry, I've worked educating people to invest, and I spend a lot of my days looking at investment portfolios, the news headlines around investing, and the theory behind getting started. And still, I've made errors along the way because no one's perfect. So try not to beat yourself up too much if you feel that you have made some little hiccups along your journey. The second thing I think that we can all take away from this is that even with small mistakes, your portfolio can still grow. So getting yourself comfortable with not being, as I had to, the good girl and doing everything in inverted commas perfectly is really, really key to having not just a successful investing journey, but also actually just feeling calm with it and not being awake at night worrying about the right or wrong decisions you might or may not make and how this is going to potentially pan out. The key thing to note is that you need to understand investments. You avoid jumping on things just because people tell you to or just because others are doing it, and actually very strategically learn what you're doing and set it up for the long run. This usually is the simplest way to set yourself up for long-term success within an investing portfolio. So there you have it, a bare rule from me on my investing mistakes and what you can learn from them. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Do give it, as I say, a like and subscribe if you're enjoying, and I'll see you for the next one.